Like, I thought you all have more federal land than Nevada, but Nevada has more than you?
Nevada has more. Nevada is one of the only states that has more than Utah does. About 2/3 of the land in our state is public and federal, and that's one of the distinctions that often doesn't get made but needs to be. When people talk about public lands, they're often referring only to federal public lands, and there is a difference in those. In many instances, there's a bias that I think needs to be overcome with regard to state-managed public land versus federally owned and federally managed public land. There is an assumption that is unfair and, in my experience, very untrue, that when public lands are owned and managed by a state rather than the federal government, that those lands become sort of an environmental hellscape, that they're not managed well and are managed in a way that's destructive to the environment. In my experience, quite the opposite is true. State-managed lands are managed well, and they're managed without the type of environmental degradation that we've often seen as a result of poor land management within the federal space. Now, I say that with all due respect to federal land managers who are themselves hardworking, well-intentioned, and do the best job they can. But when there is an amount of land in the United States that approaches 30% of all the land in the country that's owned by a single owner, it's really difficult to manage all of that. And as a result of that, and as a result of the fact that those managing it aren't necessarily from the state in question, and those calling the shots are in many cases hundreds or even thousands of miles away, you sometimes get very different decisions being made. If people in a particular hypothetical state, for example, discover that trees are being infected by a particular pest and that those trees are likely to be killed, they might go to the U.S. Forest Service and ask for permission to abate the nuisance, to address the infestation, and they might be denied. After they're denied, those trees might all die. When they all die, the people in that state realize that there's an enormous amount of fuel building up and becomes a veritable tinderbox for a forest fire. And so they might go back to the Forest Service and ask if they can harvest some of that timber, not necessarily for profit, but for the sake of protecting the public and protecting the watershed, protecting the environment and the wildlife that lives in the area, not to mention the other vegetation. The Forest Service might deny that request at that point, and after it's denied, eventually, sooner or later, those trees catch fire, and they do immense environmental damage. And so I think it is worth our discussing that in some cases, the federal government has done a bad job of managing its lands, not because the people who work for the federal government are bad or incompetent, but because the sheer size of the job is difficult and the nature of the job can be almost impossible. I was wondering if I could ask Ms. Longan a question. Is this, is your experience in Alaska something that bears this out from my experiences in Utah, that state lands can be well managed in an environmentally responsible fashion?
Thank you, Senator. Yes, and from the state of Alaska perspective, I thank you for sharing those comments. I shared remarks on oil and gas development earlier, and the state has been managing oil and gas producing fields for 50 years. And just as a comparison, it was only last year, 2018, when the very first bit of oil production commenced from a federal lease. And in all of the other areas of managing forest lands and managing public lands for recreation and use, I believe that the state of Alaska, as with other states in the West and across the nation, are competent. We live in our state, we care about our public lands and the resources upon them, and we are quite competent managers.
What do you think is the best way of combating the narrative that is out there among some suggesting that state-managed lands are not managed well or managed in an environmentally responsible fashion?
I would ask that people recognize various states' track records and how we're managing lands, how we're managing development and management of our own lands. And I also appreciate your comment, Senator, about the importance of states not being recognized as stakeholders, but being recognized as what we are, and we're sovereign members of government trying to manage our lands in somewhat of an equal fashion to the federal government. That coordination and consultation is key. But unfortunately, what we experience in Alaska is even though we dedicate our time and resources to share our expertise with the federal government in a lot of the plans and decisions made under FLPMA, that expertise and our interests and input are largely overlooked. So we need to have more meaningful engagement among the government agencies, federal, state, and local. And in order to address this maybe perception that the states aren't as equipped or capable of managing our lands, I do believe that that's a myth, and I believe the more that we are communicating and coordinating with each other, hopefully the federal government will have more trust.
Thank you. I appreciate that.
So